Welcome, everybody. We're pleased to have with us again Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, and currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So we're a few weeks out from Pesach at this point, and so I thought it would be nice to try to bring in some texts that we usually are thinking about as we get into Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, and talking about the plagues, the Makot, that struck Mitzrayim, and whether there are ways of reading them that perhaps we haven't considered before, that we can connect with some ideas that are often thought of as being foreign to the perspective of the Hebrew Bible. And so particularly, I guess I'm talking about ideas that people refer to now as, let's say, the macroevolution of living organisms. So things to do with Darwin and natural selection, et cetera, or at least, let's say, the emergence of new life from other forms of life over long periods of time. So I think that as a brief comment about general context for this discussion, this is something, a point I've tried to make a few times before. I think that you can learn a lot more about what the Torah has to say about many topics if you assume that it is capable of deeply understanding things about those topics, but it's going to talk about it in a way that insists on teaching what it wants to teach about them. So I don't think it works to go into the Torah and say, I'm testing whether the Torah also knows my friend's phone number or something like that, just to see if it's an unlimited fount of knowledge, because it doesn't submit itself for that kind of assessment. However, I think if an idea is fundamental in some sense to the human condition and the nature of the world, and if it's an important point of discussion because it has implications for how to view the world as an Oved Hashem, as someone who seeks to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of the world, then I do think it is fair to assume that there's a way of finding a commentary there. However, I think we sometimes are quite naive in how we approach this, because we think, for example, about evolution, the idea of animals coming from other animals over long periods of incremental change, and the descent of man from other primates, et cetera, all those kinds of things. We tend to think of that as being a topic that if you're going to have it in a book that is somewhat chronological, it should be at the beginning, right? So if the Torah were going to teach us about evolution, shouldn't it tell us about it in the first 7 days, so to speak? And then people look and they find that story sounds quite different, and then say, okay, so there's nothing in the Torah about this, and you have to pick either to believe what modern paleontologists and biologists teach us about what they understand about the world, or you can believe what the Torah is saying, but you have to pick one because they're telling you different things. And I think that's a false and unfortunate dichotomy. And that partly just stems from what I was saying before, that we're not necessarily looking in the right place or with the right intention. If we're looking at the beginning of the book to test whether the Torah is as smart as biologists, then we're going to fail. If instead we're saying the Torah is going to choose a particular moment to teach us about an idea, and it's going to perhaps do that in a different point in the narrative where it's suitable to introduce the topic, and then when we have that topic introduced, it will discuss it in its way that will allow us to recognize the topic that's being discussed, but that will interweave a commentary that doesn't allow us to just make a sort of judgment of whether there's information there or not, and that is more about making sure that we're learning something that we can use, because that's always the text's unswerving mission. So what I'm going to try to argue is that actually, if you're interested in looking for it, the Torah does have something to say about the idea of, let's say, evolution or natural selection, or the adaptation leading to new forms of life, but not not just in order to wave at you or wink at you and say that it knows something, But as always, in order to try to teach something and put that discussion in a certain context, and we're not going to find that in the beginning of the Torah, in the book of Genesis. We're going to find it actually in Sefer Shmot. And maybe we see a hint at how to start looking for that by starting outside even of the Chumash and elsewhere in Tanakh, in Nevi'im. So the first source I have here is from Sefer Yeshayahu, the prophet Isaiah. And it's a very famous passage where he's talking about a kind of an allegory of a vineyard with a tower in it, where the Navi is singing about a beloved vineyard that he worked so carefully to cultivate, and was also watching over it. And he put a tower in his vineyard in order to watch over it. But despite the fact that he did so much to care for it, it didn't produce the fruits that he intended, right? So I won't read the whole passage, but the kerem, the vineyard, what you wanted to produce is anavim, and anavim is grapes, right? But what the kerem produces instead is biushim, which is translated as wild grapes. It's some other kind of grape-like result, presumably, but it's somehow different than grapes that you want. So we can just read. Vayazkehu vayisaklehu v'yita'eu sorek vayaven migdal betocho v'gam yakev hatsev bo vayikav la'asot anavim vayas berushim. So, and he dug it and he cleared it of stones and he planted it with the choicest vine and he built a tower in the midst of it and also hewed out a vat therein, and he looked that it should bring forth grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. So the difference here again is between anavim, on the one hand, anavim is grapes, and birushim, which are the wild grapes or grapes that you don't like somehow. Maybe they're not sweet. Maybe it's like a different variety of grape that's not so productive of sugar, so maybe you can't make wine out of it. But we'd have to kind of dig further to figure out exactly what the best translation of that is. So the reason I want to start here is because I think it is significant that we have here a contemplation of an example where we have a form of life that's producing a downstream product. It is producing a next generation. So you cultivate one generation and then it produces the fruit of the next generation. And somehow that next generation doesn't have the same properties. It resembles, presumably, the previous one. I think we can assume biushim is not apples or it's not elephants, it's grapes of some kind, but they're somehow different than their parent grapes. So it's about variation through reproduction, which is a basic observable fact in biology. We also have, for example, in a passage in Sefer Bereshit, Yaakov Avinu is trying to kind of tilt the odds in his game that he's playing against his father-in-law Lavan, and it's all about whether he can get certain goats or sheep to produce progeny with certain properties. And so there's this basic fact about the world that you don't need to be Charles Darwin or a modern biologist to appreciate, which is that living things produce offspring that are not identical to them, but are also similar to them. And just once you have that basic idea, I think you have to accept that it is very readily accessible to the intuition of a relatively unsophisticated scientific mind to reason about the world and just say, okay, if your progeny don't always fully resemble you, that traits that control, whether one is tall or short, or whether one has big eyes or small eyes or whatever, those may impact what it's like to live in the world, right? What color the wool of a goat is, or what properties the grapes have, etc. And that was a practical matter for people doing animal husbandry and doing agriculture for a long time. So we think of evolution as this idea where it's this revolutionary idea that upended modern thought in the West in the last few centuries. And yes, in one sense that's true, but I think we also have to admit that this is quite unlike other aspects of modern science, in the sense that there is a lot that you can do just by observing the world and reasoning in very basic ways, where you could say, oh, it does seem to me like you could have a situation where an animal has multiple children, and some of them perish and some of them survive, and whether they perish or survive has something to do with, how strong each of them was, or whatever else. And when you reflect on that, you realize a whole lot of Sefer Bereshit is about genealogy. It's exactly about this idea of all of these progenitors who produce offspring, and then those offspring go in different directions, and they have more or less fruitful further paths ahead of them. So that doesn't mean exactly that we have, fish developing lobes and crawling out onto land and becoming amphibians, and the sort of story we get in the sort of post-Darwinian era of thinking about the emergence of life. But I do think we have to acknowledge that the raw materials for this kind of perspective on the world are pretty broadly accessible as part of the human condition. And that doesn't mean that they were codified and written down and communicated as a coherent theory that remained stable and got developed in the same way. But it does mean that we should not pretend that this kind of insight about how animal life and plant life might work must have been totally inaccessible to the mind of someone before Charles Darwin. And I think you see other evidence of that even from other contemporary thought to that of Tanakh in other cultures, if you look at the right sources. So that's just a first basic point. But now, let's carry this forward. And the word I want to focus on is Biushim. Biushim is now going to represent, it could mean many things, but Biushim right now represents the idea of variation in phenotype, in the presentation of traits in the offspring of some reproducing living thing, and how that carries forward elsewhere in the text. So now I want to talk a little bit about what happens in Mitzrayim, in the Exodus from Egypt, and just point out some things that are there that start to parallel this discussion in ways we may not have noticed just because we hear them over and over again and never see them presented in that light. So there's a set of events that kicks off the kind of Pesach, Haggadah story, telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, where Moshe and Aaron go to Paro and they make signs to him, such as, Aaron throws his staff on the ground and it turns into a tanin, which is a crocodile or a dragon or a dinosaur or some kind of reptile, some kind of serpent, whatever. And that already is a little bit interesting. We had another shiur about taninim. The tanin is a curious animal from the standpoint of how the Torah treats that subject, because it is, let's say, strongly associated with the idea of the unfathomable depths that both connect with past eras in which other life existed and might have been swept away by cataclysmic events, and also the idea of being swallowed up by the earth and still being a replica of something that's alive. So Taninim as a reptile symbol with the association of unfathomable depths becomes maybe an emblem for how Tanakh talks about fossils and things of that nature. So that's an interesting way to kick off this whole interaction with Paro. And we can ask why that was brought up, but not focusing on that point. So this sign is given to Paro, and then of course we start with the Makot. Like the 10 plagues are a sequence of events, and we're not going to talk about all of them, but the first one is also a sign that was given to Moshe to bring to Paro, which is mixing the water of the Yeor with the dirt of the ground. The Yeor is the Nile, and it's going to become dam bayabeshet. It's going to become blood on the dry ground. So it's about sort of the beginning of life. So just in rapid sequence, the first few events that happen are the Yeor turns to blood, the Nile turns to blood, and it becomes inhospitable to the life of the Nile. And one of the things we're told is that the fish died, right? So that just we take as given. Oh yeah, of course, if it turned to blood, then probably the animals in it would die, especially. So it says, "V'adaga asher b'yor tamut, uvasha yor v'nil'u Mitzrayim lishtot mayim min hayor." So the fish that are in the river died, and the river, sorry, this is not in the past tense. The fish that are in the river shall die, and the river shall become foul, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink water from the river. So that's the first thing that happens. Fish die after the Nile turns to blood. Then what happens next? So we go on to the second plague. The first plague was dam, there was blood. What's the second plague? The second plague is tzfardea, is frogs. So now we have the same mate of Moshe, which he was holding over the or before, or striking the or with to turn into blood. Now he's holding it over the or, and you're having frogs jump out of the Nile. And I'll note as well that this mate of Moshe that's being used is not the mate of Aaron that turned into a tanin, but it is also a mate that turns into a reptile. It turns into a nahash, a serpent, definitely a serpent, as opposed to the tanin, which is, you could say, maybe various different things that are reptilian. But interestingly, the nahash serpent, in this mate of Moshe, is also something we can associate in an interesting way with kind of primordial reptilianness, right? Because the word nahash, when it first appears in the Torah, it's in Gan Eden, and it's this very significant animal. It's not just an animal lying around. It's the cleverest beast of the field. And what is clever about it? Well, what's interesting about Nahashim specifically is they are very much an emblem of kind of backwards evolution, or like transformation, because they're clearly reptiles, but they don't have arms and legs. And so they represent the idea of being descended from something that might have had arms and legs. And as much as that might sound like an introduction of a very modern idea into a text that doesn't comprehend it, it should be noted that the sages, thousands of years ago, made exactly this comment. They said the Nahash and Gan Eden had arms and legs. And we think of that, perhaps when we hear it, as being a comment about the Nahash as maybe being more human-like, because it's talking and it's involved somehow in maneuvering to perhaps get to marry Chava instead of Adam, all the other stuff that's associated with that midrash. But a basic point is that it was easy for Chazal to imagine that this animal used to have arms and legs, and really that's even maybe implicit in the Edenic narrative as well, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu afterwards says to the Nachash, since you did this, now you're cursed amongst all the beasts, and al gechon chatelech, like now you crawl in your belly, which is perhaps where Chazal are getting the idea that previously the serpent didn't. So we have the Tanin, which is about unfathomable depths of the ocean and cataclysm and perhaps fossils in ways that we built up in another shiur. We also have the Nahash, which is this emblem of, it sheds its skin. It's called Erum Mikol Chayat Sadeh. It's the naked but also clever animal. So it's the animal that can change itself and is both kind of clever by doing that, and also ultimately can show us how descendants of an animal can be very different in their properties than their progenitors, because it can lose its arms and legs. So we have two ideas of reptiles with some association of either primordial cataclysm or change over time, and some evolutionary idea. So we already have an emblem connected with the idea of evolution that's being introduced there. But then what happens? This mateh, this staff of Moshe, first it's turning the yaor into blood. And we'll note that is interesting, because that's sort of turning what we think of as water, as something that's not alive, into something that is the essence of life. So it's about the emergence of life-likeness, the essence of life-likeness from non-life-likeness. It's kind of the beginning of life. And then you have next, in that environment, that change, the water to blood transition, is killing the fish. So the fish die. So that is what you'd call an environmental shock that leads to a strong selection against being a fish, right? Fish die because they can't get out of the water. But what can get out of the water? Frogs, right? So when the frogs jump out of the yaor, when the frogs leave the Nile, is it the case that it's because Moshe is holding the staff over the Nile and only then they would jump out? Or is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling Moshe to hold the staff over the yaor to sort of keep the branding up, as far as this sequence of events is still associated with this staff? But it also stands very much to reason that frogs can leave the yaor in a way that fish cannot. And so the frogs jump out. Now, I'll say also about frogs that it's interesting that it's not telling us, for example, that the hippopotami in the Yaor crawled out of the Nile, right? They also probably wouldn't like it if the water that they were in turned to blood. But why are we focusing on frogs specifically? Frogs, interestingly, because they're amphibians, are the animals that in their own life cycle physically instantiate the transition from being a fish with no arms and legs that just swims around in the water to being a two-armed and two-legged creature that crawls on land. Now, the tadpoles from which amphibians come are not actually fish in the taxonomic sense, but as far as the image they present, they look like some kind of fish that happens not to have scales. When they're little, they have a little tail and maybe fins and gills. And then they morphose and transform, and they turn into animals that have lungs and that can go on land and all of that. So there's a recognition in this sequence of events that when you go from blood to fish to frogs, that you're starting with some idea of a lifelike primordial soup, like blood. Blood is the essence of life, that you just have like liquid teeming with life. And then there can be changes in there that lead to the death of animals that have some traits and the escape and survival of animals that have other traits. And in that exact moment, what we're seeing is fish going down and amphibians that are the most obvious outgrowth of fish, because we see them turn from fish into land animals in their own lifetime. Not actually from fish, but you get the idea. That whole trajectory is emblematically demonstrating to us the idea of variation in biological form coming from selection, from changes in environment, where certain living things don't succeed and other ones do succeed. And it all can be thought of as a chain of events transpiring over time. So that as a bit of a fragment is, let's say, interesting because it's sort of like taking a piece of Tanakh and turning it around until you realize it's kind of shaped like something else you've heard of before. But is it a coincidence that we are noticing this resemblance? In other words, could it be that the text happens to be paralleling something that we think of as usually having to do with how we understand biological evolution, but there's no point to it and it's not demarcated in any way? So the way I want to point to the way the text hints at the fact that this is being done deliberately is going back to the source from Yeshayahu. Remember, we said that this idea of wild grapes, of progeny that are different from the parent, is denoted with this word be'ushim, the last word in this source. So I want to focus on this root, bet aleph shin. So if we now go to turning the Nile into blood, turning the Yaor into dam, one of the things we're told is that the water is going to stink, which is this kind of environmental negativity that we're going to be reacting to. And the word for that stinking Nile is bash. It says uvash hayaor. So we have a bet aleph shin root appearing again with the stinking of the blood that's killing the fish. And then we go on to the frogs. And what happens after the frogs jump out? First, they leave the Yaor, they jump around everywhere. Everyone's very upset about frogs jumping everywhere. And then when it all kind of winds to a close with the frog plague, at the end it says that they all died. All the frogs themselves died because they also needed to go back into the water. And it says, Vayitzberu tam hamarim vativ'ash haaretz. So they piled up all the dead frogs and gathered them together in heaps. And it says the land stank. So again, you have vativ'ash haaretz. So bet aleph shin again appearing. So this word be'ushim, which we said is our talisman for the idea of variation, biological variation of progeny relative to their parents, that's actually going as a thread through this whole passage that we just said has all of these elements in it that parallel the idea of biological evolution. The blood of the Nile stinks and kills the fish, and then when the frogs die and they're piled up, they also stink. And that word for stinking is the same bet aleph shin that's appearing where we have originally this idea of birushim. Now, of course, Yeshayahu Hanavi is coming after this text in Tanakh, but I think what you can see it as is it's a commentary by the Navi on what he's seeing here in the text anyway, that this Bet Aleph Shin is something he's pulling on. So the idea of Birushim, maybe you could say the use of that term for wild grapes is read into the text later, but it becomes a way of summarizing things that are being seen in Chumash itself. So where do we go from here? Well, I think that the next thing we have to ask is why would the text bring this subject in here, right? If the Torah is going to take up the idea of biological evolution, then why would it do so at this moment? And what's the point of that? And what are we meant to learn from it? And here I think we can make a preliminary comment, and maybe we can circle back further at the end once we see it in more of a broader context. But I think one of the basic points it has to be this, that as many people have observed, part of the point of all the makot, all the plagues in Mitzrayim, is that that Moshe is trying to demonstrate on behalf of Hashem that Paro is not the king of nature, that in fact HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Hashem is the king of nature. And that means that all the things that happen in nature are really subservient to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's agenda, and they don't follow the laws that Paro claims to understand or to have legislated himself as a deity for how nature works. And to the degree that that's the case, the idea of biological evolution has to be understood as being wrapped up in that notion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashgacha over creation. That when we talk about evolution, sometimes from the standpoint of how scientists introduce it, there, in addition to the idea of variation in progeny and perhaps success or failure, partly based on your interaction with your environment, there's also this idea of kind of the randomness of it, that you can just have random variation, and it will be the case that you get selection of traits that accumulate, even though the underlying process by which this variation is happening and the events of the world are happening might be unpredictable and even drawn from some random distribution. And so you can get the emergence of adaptation in a system where there isn't any point or oversight or sort of goal that the system has, but we still end up noticing things that look like the achievement of goals because of the adaptation of the relationship between the living things and the environment that they inhabit. But here, I think we have to look at this idea somewhat differently. If we're going to talk about evolution as a biological idea in the context of Torah, we don't say that, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does certain things and decides certain things in the world, but with evolution, he just kind of lets the dice roll and things happen, and whatever comes out, comes out. It all needs to be in his hands, so to speak. And so part of what the text is bringing in here is kind of saying, on the one hand, yes, perhaps evolutionary processes of the Darwinian sort, where you have reproduction and selection, that may be part of how Hashem acts in the world, but he's the one doing the selecting, right? And sometimes that may look quite generic because he doesn't particularly want at that moment to make the selective pressures some living organisms are subject to look like it expresses an intention that's obvious on his part. But other times he can start to say, look, I want you to pay attention. Right now, I'm showing you my intention. Right now, these fish and these frogs are dying or jumping around or whatever, or this blood is coming or receding because it's part of the message that I have to give to Paro that Moshe is conveying. And so at this moment, I will show you my hand, my yad chazaka, my manifested intervention in the events of the world. But that doesn't mean it's out of my hand in other circumstances. You can recognize that what's happening here is not that Hashem is choosing to act at this moment, and in other times, he's not the one deciding things. Instead, it's that he's always the one that's deciding things, but what he chooses to do at certain moments is to advertise that more and to make that more apparent. And so when he's talking about redeeming Bnei Israel from Mitzrayim, biyad chazaka uvizruah netuyah, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, that's about our ability to recognize his role and his intention in the shaping of events. But it can be that in that moment, the same things that are happening from another perspective just look like biology. And it's just a question of, so to speak, when the cataclysm comes that wipes out the fish and favors the frogs, is that coming because it fits with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's agenda in a way we can appreciate? Or, we happen not to see how it suits his agenda at that moment. So I think that's one basic idea that we can bring in here, is that it's a unification of the idea of Darwinian evolution on the one hand with the idea of the hashgacha of the world's creator, the oversight of the world's creator over the events of the world. Those are not at loggerheads, because it can certainly be the case that if Hashem wants to make a bunch of animals, that maybe he'll do that using biological evolution, and maybe he'll be perfectly happy to let a lot of that proceed in ways where there's no obvious intention to any of the events that shape that process of adaptation. But it still can be the case that at any moment he wants, he can start stacking the deck so that not only is there a process of adaptation happening, but there's also a message contained within it. And I think perhaps one of the best summaries of this idea, once we recognize it in that way, is coming from the culminating Makkah, the way that we end this sequence of events. And that really is the ultimate point somehow of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to do to Mitzrayim, to teach the world about his role in it and his relationship to his people. Because what's the last plague? It's Makat Bechorot. It's the striking of the firstborn. So it's a plague that strikes not only people, but also animals, right? It's that the Torah is explicit in saying that. It's Behema, the beast, as well as the human being. And what is the Bechor? The Bechor is the firstborn. It's the living thing that came first. It's the one that was first supreme and first powerful, because by being born first, it had a head start. And in one sense, you could say that Mitzrayim probably regarded itself as the Bechor among the nations, right? Because it was, if not the first, certainly one of the first great millennial civilizations of the ancient world. And so Makat Bechorot is not just about killing the firstborn of Egypt, who are human beings and animals that happen to be the first issue of their mother's womb, but it's a broader idea. It's about the idea of just because you're born first doesn't mean you rule forever. And that is a very powerful idea, biologically speaking, in the discussion of evolution. Whether we're talking about dinosaurs, who are one kind of firstborn, and that connects back with another shiur that we did in this series, having to do with dinosaurs and the Levitical priesthood, because the Levitical priesthood is both talked about in our tradition as having overtaken a more ancient lineage of priesthood extending from Shem, from Noach and Shem down through the descendants of Shem and into Melchizedek, Melech Shalem. Or also, we're told in the Torah elsewhere that the Leviim, the Shevet Levi, has taken over their role from the Bechor, from the actual firstborn of Israel. That there's some sense in which we have to do a pidyon, a redemption of the firstborn when a firstborn son is born, so that we can demonstrate this relationship between firstbornness and priesthood. So over and over again, as this theme in our narratives and also in halakha, in our laws, we have this idea that just because someone is born first doesn't mean they maintain some supremacy forever. And that idea also has an evolutionary aspect to it, that there are animals that came earlier, right? But their environment changed and they no longer could remain supreme, whether because a meteor fell on them or because now there's oxygen or because now they need to get out of the water and they can't, or whatever. There are changes that lead to the throwing down of the mighty and then the supreme who had primacy because they came first, and the lifting up of the new. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu injects that idea into the center of this whole process of Yetziat Mitzrayim, so that it becomes the platform on which he builds the idea of Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, B'ni Bechori Yisrael. He says that Yisrael is his firstborn. But what does that mean to be HaKadosh Baruch Hu's firstborn? It's not that we came first. We didn't exist as a nation before this moment of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And so Hashem is saying that the sort of terrestrial firstbornness that seems like it gives you the eternal advantage, that's not the way he made the world. He made the world to be an evolutionary world in which what came first can be replaced by what comes after. But the reason that Bnei Yisrael become the Bechor of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what that means is we have an eternal relationship with him, that the brit we have with him does not subject us to the same kind of selection. So Mitzrayim can come and go, Bavel can come and go, but Am Yisrael having made this brit, this covenant that will be made at Sinai, at Har Chorev, and receive the Torah, that's a relationship that's going to operate according to other rules. And so we don't worry about Am Yisrael being superannuated and superseded and overtaken and replaced through a process of selection that will eventually move on to some other nation that will assume the role of Mamlechet Kohanim, of a nation of priests. And so that, I think, starts to give you a sense of how evolutionary ideas are actually perhaps at the center of much of what the text is trying to talk about in Yetziat Mitzrayim and Agadah Pesach and the Makot and all of this, but how this really becomes a way of understanding something about the role of Bnei Israel and our special relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how we stand apart from all this sort of nations of Bechorot or Bechorim, of firstborn supreme powers that eventually couldn't adapt, and that somehow we're distinct from and separate from that law of nature by which HaKadosh Baruch Hu rules over his creation and shapes it and transforms it over time. So a last point I just want to make by way of pulling all these things together is that I think that if you're looking for a kind of capstone on this whole point, the question is, where else can we look for this root Bet Aleph Shin, or calling it a root is maybe the wrong term, but the sequence of letters Bet Aleph Shin that might pull some of these things together, because we have this idea now that the mateh, that the staff, which is a serpent, and nachash, is central to all of this, and is an emblem for all of this, and it was playing a role in these makot. But if we go back to where Moshe got this staff from, then we can see one last point that maybe ties a bunch of these different ideas together. Because where did Moshe get his staff? He got his mateh from HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Har Sinai or Har Chorev, and he had the staff with him, and Hashem told him to throw it on the ground, and it turned into a nachash. We're not going to read through this whole source, but what I want to emphasize in this source is that this is a place where Moshe received his staff, and it's also a place where what happened? It says, when Hashem manifests himself to Moshe, we read, Vayira malach Adonai elav b'lebat esh mitoch hasne, vayar vehini hasne bo'er ba'esh, vehasne enenu kal. So the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire. The word with fire is ba'esh, bet aleph shin, and the bush was not consumed. So actually, in this place and in this moment where Moshe is getting his mateh, which is the evolvable reptile staff that is an emblem for this kind of reshapability of biology, that at that moment, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also giving us here in the text of the Torah this same sequence of Beit Aleph Shin that Yeshayahu recognizes and relays in his introduction of the idea of Berushim. So this Ba'esh thread traces all the way back to this moment, and I think that that's not accidental, obviously, in a sense, with respect to the other narrative elements we are pulling together. This is the beginning of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and it's also going to connect to all these other moments in Yetziat Mitzrayim with the Makot that we were just discussing, with the plagues. But in another sense, we can see a different perspective here, because if we look now to a different place, we look at a place where the Torah talks about another idea that we often hear about in connection with evolution, the idea of a tree of life. That when people draw genealogies of living organisms or of people or whatever else, the picture looks like a tree. You have all these dividing branches because individuals produce progeny, and so you have these kind of nodes that produce multiple branches going downstream. And even when biologists today want to represent their model of the descent of different forms of life from each other, they often call it a tree of life, but it's a tree as an image that represents specifically genealogical reasoning, or the descent of one organism from another. But what if we talk about the tree of life as the Torah discusses it, the idea of Etz Chaim? Where do we get this idea? So the tree of life is mentioned in Gan Eden at the beginning in Sefer Bereshit. Vayomer Adonai Elohim, hen ha'adam haya ke'ahad mimenu, לדעת טוב ורע, ועתה פן ישלח ידו, ולקח וגם מעץ החיים, ואכל וחי לעולם. So, behold, man has become one of us to know good and evil, and now lest he put forth his hand and take also from the tree of life, and eat and live forever. So what does Hashem do? He guards the tree of life. He puts cheruvim, sometimes translated as cherubs, to guard the tree of life. And so cherubs are, we learn elsewhere in Tanakh, some kind of malach or angel type thing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has put to guard the tree of life. And it's interesting because when human beings are thrown out of Gan Eden, the cheruvim are set there to guard it. So they're set there lishmor et derech etz ha'chaim. So they're set to guard the way of the tree of life, and they're guarding it. It's hakorvim ve'et lahat ha'herev hamitapechet. So the burning, fiery, flipping sword or transforming sword. You know, lafoch is both flipping, but also maybe transformation, which is interesting. So what are the different elements here? We have an angel, like some kind of malach. It's the keruv. We have a fire. We have a sword. We have a tree of life. So it's like a special plant that's connected with the idea of life, and even the sort of perhaps the idea of branching genealogical lineages, which is a very easy idea to connect in general with the notion of a tree of life, like representing all of life as one tree. And we have a nachash, we have a serpent. All of those different elements. So now let's go over here, back to Moshe, where he's receiving his mateh. We have a nachash, right? We have a serpent. We have a fire, we have esh. We have a malach, we have an angel. We have a plant, the sneh, right? And I know there's one element I want to finish on, but I'm looking to see if there's another thing that I wanted to include first. I think that we got everything there except for one thing, which is also there, right? So we said we needed a sword. So we had fire, an angel, and a serpent, and a plant, but we also need a sword. So where's the sword here? Well, what is this place? Where is Moshe? He's in Chorev, right? So Chorev is the same as the word Cherev. Cherev is sword. So the hint in the text is not in a literal mention of a sword here, because Chorev could mean dry. It could mean different things if we try to actually translate the word, but the letters are the same. It's Het Resh Vav, sorry, Het Resh Vet. And so we also have the Cherev. So that's I think a pretty sizable pile of different elements that completely parallel each other in these two passages. And I would say that in the end, what it's showing us is that this idea of Ba'esh, Bet Aleph Shin, the idea of evolutionary transformation over time through diversification of one's progeny, that idea is an idea that the Torah understands, that it puts centrally into the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that it also connects back to Gan Eden and Etz Chaim, the tree of life, which remarkably, as a term, tree of life, remains today as a central kind of imagery that even scientists use to talk about the descent of one organism from another, and macroevolution, and the diversity of life coming from natural selection. So rolling it all together, I think coming to a close around the same idea we were discussing before, I think the point is that if you want to talk about the world in evolutionary terms, the Torah is happy to do that with you, and is even happy to present a kind of commentary in miniature at how the mechanism of that biological process might work with the fish and the frogs, etc. But it's not going to do that, as many scientists, I think, erroneously and scientifically often do. It's not going to do it as a way of explaining the way the world is, in contradistinction to the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu plays a role in the events of the world and chooses them. It's going to say, sure, he's choosing all the events, and sometimes you don't understand when or why things happen, and viewed from that perspective, you can still see a process of adaptation and selection happening over time, which is part of his ratzon, part of his desire, in how he's shaping the world through events that may seem random to you. But that same kind of set of events can also, in another moment, be highly non-random, and they can be part of a message from Hashem to Paro relayed through Moshe. And the biology looks the same, but the other layers of meaning are more apparent to us at these moments when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to show us his Yad Hazakah, his strong hand. And that's something that we can bring into our understanding of Yetziat Mitzrayim when we're reading Haggadah Shel Pesach coming up in a few weeks.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.